On the morning of June 20th, 2001, in Houston, Texas, a 911 operator answered a call that would stop an entire nation cold. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, almost detached. A mother said she needed the police. When officers arrived, there were no signs of a break-in, no struggle, no chaos, just silence. Inside the home, 5 children had been laid out, one by one, as if someone had tried to put them to rest. In the bathroom, water still lingered in the tub. The woman who made the call didn't run. She didn't hide. She waited. Her name was Andrea Yates. Within hours, she would confess to drowning all 5 of her children. But what shocked the world wasn't just what she did. It was what she believed. Because in her mind, this wasn't murder. This was salvation. And the question that followed would divide a nation. Was she evil or was she insane? Before the headlines, before the trial, before the question of insanity, Andrea Yates was known as something else entirely. A nurse, a high achiever, quiet, disciplined, deeply devoted to her family. She grew up in Houston, Texas, where she excelled in school, graduating near the top of her class and serving as captain of her swim team. By all outward appearances, her life was stable, structured, predictable. As an adult, she became a registered nurse and worked at a respected cancer center. That's where she met Rusty Yates, an engineer with strong religious beliefs and a clear vision for family life. They married in 1993. And from the beginning, they agreed on one thing. They would have a large family. Children came quickly, one after another. And at first, everything seemed normal. But beneath the surface, something had always been there. Long before motherhood, Andrea had struggled with depression. As a teenager, she spoke about suicide, about feeling overwhelmed, about losing control. Those moments didn't define her life, but they never fully disappeared either. They stayed quiet, unseen, managed, until the pressure began to build, because with each child, the demands grew, the exhaustion deepened, the isolation increased, and slowly, almost invisibly at first, the foundation beneath her life began to shift. What once felt stable was becoming fragile, and no one, not her family, not her doctors, not even Andrea herself, fully understood where it was heading. Because this wasn't a sudden break. It was the beginning of something gradual, something quiet, something that would grow until it couldn't be ignored anymore. After the birth of her 4th child, something changed. The depression returned, but this time, it didn't stay quiet. It deepened. Andrea Yates began to withdraw from the world around her. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, At times, she became nearly catatonic. What had once been manageable was now overwhelming. Doctors began to understand the severity of what they were seeing. Andrea was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis, a rare but severe mental condition that can distort reality itself. She was hospitalized, given medication, monitored closely. For a moment, it seemed like things might stabilize, but the improvement didn't last. She was released, then hospitalized again. The cycle continued. At one point, Andrea held a knife to her own throat, begging to die. The warning signs were no longer subtle. They were urgent. Doctors made it clear she required close supervision, that she was at serious risk of harming herself or others. They also warned against having more children, saying another pregnancy could trigger another psychotic break. But not long after being discharged, Andrea became pregnant again. And with that, the fragile balance she had been holding on to began to slip even further. By the time her fifth child was born, the line between reality and delusion was no longer steady. It was shifting, unstable, and increasingly difficult to recognize, even for the people closest to her. Because what was happening wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was quiet, internal, and getting worse. By early 2001, Andrea Yates was no longer just struggling. She was unraveling. Her condition, postpartum psychosis, had worsened, pulling her further from reality. Doctors adjusted medications, starting, stopping, changing doses, trying to find something that would stabilize her. But nothing seemed to hold. Andrea began hearing things, seeing things, believing things that weren't real. And slowly, those beliefs began to take shape. They became focused, obsessive. She grew increasingly fixated on religion, reading the Bible constantly, interpreting its messages in extreme, literal ways. But what she saw in those words wasn't comfort. It was judgment. She became convinced she was a bad mother, that she was failing her children, not just emotionally, but spiritually. And in her mind, that failure had consequences, eternal ones. Andrea believed Satan was influencing her, that her presence, her actions, were corrupting her children. And if that was true, then their souls were at risk. Not someday, not hypothetically, but right now. To her, this wasn't fear. It was certainty. And once that belief took hold, everything else began to fall away. Logic, reason, doubt, replaced by something far more dangerous, conviction. Because if you truly believe your children are doomed, and you believe you are the cause, then the question changes. It's no longer, what should I do? It becomes, what do I have to do? And by the time those thoughts fully took hold, Andrea Yates wasn't just losing touch with reality. She was living in a completely different one. There were warnings, clear ones. Doctors treating Andrea Yates understood how serious her condition had become. This wasn't depression alone. This was psychosis. They stressed that she needed constant supervision, that she was at serious risk of harming herself or others. But outside the hospital, real life continued. And in that space between medical advice and daily reality, things began to slip. Her husband, Rusty Yates, was trying to hold everything together. 5 children, a household, a wife in crisis. And like many families facing something they don't fully understand, he made decisions based on hope. Hope that she was improving. Hope that structure would help. Hope that normalcy could return. So he began leaving her alone for short periods of time. Not out of neglect, but out of belief. Belief that she was getting better, even as the signs suggested otherwise. Andrea was withdrawing further, speaking less, eating less, drifting further from reality. And then there was a moment, one that would later stand out. Andrea filled the bathtub in the middle of the day. No emergency, no reason, just the water slowly rising. Later, she would admit she had considered harming her children then, but she stopped. Not because the thoughts disappeared, but because something interrupted them. A pause, a moment of hesitation, one last barrier still holding. Doctors hospitalized her again shortly after, adjusted medications, tried once more to stabilize her. And again, she was released, sent home, back into the same environment, back into the same pressure, back into the same mind that was no longer grounded in reality. And in the days that followed, the safeguards weakened, the supervision loosened, and the window, the one that had almost opened before, was about to open again. This time, without interruption. The morning of June 20th, 2001, began like any other. Inside a quiet home in Houston, Texas, 5 children woke up to a normal day. Breakfast, routine, nothing out of place. Andrea Yates moved through the house as she always had. There were no alarms, no outward signs of what was coming. Her husband, Rusty Yates, left for work. He expected someone else to arrive shortly to help care for the children. But for a brief period of time, Andrea was alone with them. Inside her mind, the reality she was living in had already taken hold. This wasn't a sudden decision. She later admitted she had thought about harming her children before. The idea wasn't new, but now it felt necessary, certain. She believed Satan was influencing her, that her children were being corrupted because of her, and that if she didn't act, their souls would be lost. In that moment, the world around her, the house, the routine, the ordinary details, faded, replaced by something else, a belief so strong it overpowered everything else. And once that belief settled in, there was no hesitation left. Andrea walked into the bathroom. She turned on the water, and slowly the bathtub began to fill. Not rushed, not chaotic, just deliberate. Because in her mind, this wasn't violence, it was purpose. And what would happen next would unfold in silence. What happened next didn't unfold in chaos. It happened in silence. Inside the bathroom, the water had already filled the tub. Andrea Yates moved with purpose, one child at a time. No shouting, no struggle heard beyond those walls. Just a series of actions carried out in isolation. She began with the younger children, and after each one, she carried them to a bed, laid them down, covered them, as if trying to restore some kind of order to something that could never be made right. Then came Mary, and finally, Noah, the oldest. He saw something was wrong. He asked questions, and then he ran. It was the only moment where the silence broke, but not for long. Andrea caught him, and he became the last. When it was over, the house was still again. 5 children gone, and Andrea Yates stood alone in the quiet. The belief that had driven her actions, that this was necessary, that this was saving them, remained. There was no panic, no attempt to escape. Instead, she turned away from the bathroom, walked to the phone, and prepared to tell someone what she had done. After it was over, the silence didn't break. It deepened. Inside the house, nothing moved. No voices, no footsteps. Just stillness. Andrea Yates walked to the phone and dialed 911. Her voice was steady, controlled. She told the operator she needed the police. Then she called her husband, told him to come home. There was no attempt to hide what had happened, no effort to explain it away. Only waiting. When officers arrived, they stepped into something they weren't prepared for. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. Just a quiet home and a mother standing inside it. Andrea appeared calm, flat. She didn't resist, didn't deny anything. She told them exactly what she had done. Inside the house, officers began to understand the scale of it. Upstairs, the children had been placed together, covered, arranged. In the bathroom, the tub still held traces of water. Nothing about the scene was chaotic. It was deliberate. And that's what made it harder to process. At the station, Andrea continued speaking. She explained that she had waited until she was alone, that she believed her husband would have stopped her. And then she explained why. She believed Satan was influencing her, that her children were being corrupted because of her, and that by killing them, she had saved them. To her, this wasn't a crime. It was protection. But for investigators, those same statements raised a different question. Not just what she did, but whether she understood that it was wrong. Because under Texas law, that single question would determine everything that came next. In 2002, the case moved into a courtroom in Harris County, Texas. 5 children were dead. A mother had confessed. But this trial wasn't about what happened. It was about why. And more importantly, whether Andrea Yates understood that what she did was wrong. The defense built their case around one central argument. Andrea was severely mentally ill. They pointed to years of documented breakdowns, hospitalizations, suicide attempts, psychotic episodes. Doctors diagnosed her with postpartum psychosis, a condition capable of completely distorting reality. Experts for the defense testified that Andrea believed she was saving her children, that in her mind, her actions were not only justified, they were necessary. But under Texas law, mental illness alone isn't enough. The standard comes from the McNaughton rule, which asks a single critical question. Did she know right from wrong at the exact moment of the crime? That's where the prosecution focused. They didn't deny she was mentally ill. Instead, they argued something more precise, that she knew exactly what she was doing. They pointed to her actions. She waited until she was alone. She acted methodically. She called police afterward. To them, those weren't the actions of someone disconnected from reality. They were the actions of someone aware of her choices. And then they brought in a key witness, a forensic psychiatrist whose testimony would shape everything that followed. When the prosecution called its key expert to the stand, the direction of the trial began to shift. His name was Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist with experience in some of the country's most high-profile cases. He agreed that Andrea Yates was mentally ill, but that wasn't the question. The question was whether she knew right from wrong. And Dietz said she did. He pointed to her actions, the timing, the method, the control. Waiting until she was alone, carrying out each step deliberately, calling police afterward. To him, those weren't signs of confusion. They were signs of awareness. But then he introduced something else, something that would stay with the jury. Dietz testified that shortly before the murders, an episode of Law and Order had aired, an episode involving a mother who drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He suggested Andrea may have seen it, that she could have been influenced, that she understood how such a crime might be judged. It was a powerful idea because it reframed everything. Not a psychotic break, but a calculated act. And for the jury, that mattered. After hearing weeks of testimony, they deliberated. Not for days, for hours. And when they returned, the decision was clear. Guilty. Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder. The prosecution had sought the death penalty, but the jury declined. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison. For many, the case was over. Justice had been decided. But what the jury didn't know, what no one in that courtroom realized at the time, was that a key part of the testimony they relied on wasn't true. And once that truth came out, everything would change. Not long after the verdict, the foundation of the case began to crack. It centered on one detail, a piece of testimony that should never have been given. During the trial, Park Dietz told the jury that an episode of Law and Order had aired. An episode where a mother drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He suggested that Andrea Yates may have seen it, that it may have influenced her. But that episode didn't exist. It had never aired. It wasn't real. And once that was discovered, everything changed. Because this wasn't a minor detail. It went directly to the question the jury had to answer. Did she understand right from wrong? In 2005, an appeals court ruled that the testimony could have influenced the verdict. Her conviction was overturned. A new trial was ordered. In 2006, Andrea Yates returned to court. Same case, same facts. But this time, the focus stayed where it always should have been: her mental state. The defense presented years of documented illness, hospitalizations, suicide attempts, psychotic breaks. Experts explained how postpartum psychosis can distort reality so completely that a person may believe something horrific is necessary. The prosecution argued she still understood her actions. But this time, the balance had shifted. When the jury returned, the verdict was different. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Andrea Yates was committed to a state mental hospital, where she remains today. Not free. Not imprisoned in the traditional sense, but living in the aftermath of a tragedy that cannot be undone, and a case that still leaves one question behind. When the mind breaks, where does responsibility end? 5 children lost. A mother whose mind had fractured beyond recognition. The case of Andrea Yates doesn't offer a clean ending, because it was never a simple story. It forces a question we still struggle to answer. When someone commits an unthinkable act, but believes they're doing the right thing, what does justice look like? Is it punishment, treatment, or something in between? Even now, years later, this case continues to divide opinion. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the answer isn't. If this episode made you think, if it challenged what you believe about crime, responsibility, and mental illness, follow Unsaid Case Files. Share this episode. And if there's a case you think deserves to be heard, leave it in the comments. Because sometimes the most important parts of a story are the ones left unsaid.